Okay, so think about this for a second. Like all the automation running behind the scenes,
Mhm. Yeah,
it's kind of wild. Everything online these days relies on it in some way.
it really does. Yeah. Every website, every app, there's this like hidden world of processes making it all work.
And for developers out there, picking the right tools to handle that automation is huge. It's like choosing the foundation of your whole project.
Couldn't agree more. It can make or break your workflow for sure.
So today we're tackling a comparison that's super relevant right now for anyone doing web automation. We're talking Playwright versus Selenium in 2024.
Exactly. And to guide our deep dive, we have a fantastic resource from Nick Webson over at Rebrowser. His article, Playwright versus Selenium, the ultimate comparison guide for web automation in 2024, is a really solid overview of where things stand. It came out just a few months ago, so it's super up to date.
And our goal today is to make this as straightforward as possible for you. We've gone through that whole article, pulled out the most important takeaways. We're going to break it all down so you can quickly grasp the core differences between these two powerful tools. We'll look at how they perform in real-world scenarios and see what the wider developer community has to say.
Consider this your shortcut to understanding this critical decision.
So to kick things off, let's set the stage with a high-level comparison.
Sounds good.
When you put Playwright and Selenium side by side, some key differences jump right out.
Definitely. For starters, there's the year of release. Playwright is relatively new, hitting the scene in 2020, backed by Microsoft. Selenium, on the other hand, has been around much longer. It debuted way back in 2004, driven by the open source community.
That difference in age alone hints that there might be some pretty fundamental differences in how they approach things.
Absolutely. You can kind of see their development philosophies reflected in their architectures. Playwright leans heavily on the Chrome DevTools protocol, or CDP for short, and it utilizes those native browser protocols. This gives it a really direct line of communication with the browser itself. Selenium, though, primarily uses the WebDriver protocol, which is a W3C standard.
So what does that actually mean for developers using these tools? Like, what are the practical implications of those different approaches?
Well, with Playwright and its direct CDP connection, you often get faster execution speeds. It also means you have more granular control over the browser's internal workings, which can be super useful for those tricky edge cases, or if you're testing very specific browser behaviors.
Makes sense.
Selenium with WebDriver benefits from that standardization, but it can add a bit of an extra layer in that communication process.
Gotcha. So in terms of keeping track of versions, as of this year, Playwright is at 1.41 and Selenium's at 4.16.
Right. Both are actively maintained and updated, which is good news for developers.
For sure. Now let's talk about getting started. That initial setup experience can really color your perception of a tool, especially when you're starting a brand new project.
Oh, absolutely. First impressions matter.
So how do they compare in that regard?
Playwright is designed for a really streamlined, almost effortless setup. The article mentions that you can often be up and running in less than 5 minutes.
That's pretty impressive.
It is. If you're working with Node.js, it's as simple as running a couple of commands in your terminal, npm init playwright at latest, and then npx playwright install. And what's really neat is that you can even specify which browsers you want to install right then and there. Chromium, Firefox, or WebKit, it takes care of everything for you.
So you can dive straight into writing your tests without having to mess around with drivers and configurations.
Exactly. Playwright handles all that browser driver management behind the scenes. You don't have to go hunting for the right driver executables for each browser version you need to test.
That's a huge time saver right there.
Yeah, it really streamlines things. Selenium, though, offers greater flexibility when it comes to browser versions and fine-tuning configurations.
More options, but potentially more setup.
Exactly. The guide gives a Python example where you're importing the necessary modules from Selenium, setting up Chrome options, and then using something like WebDriver Manager to automate the driver installation.
Okay, so WebDriver Manager simplifies things a bit, but it's still an additional dependency that you need to manage.
Right. It's an extra step, an external component, whereas Playwright integrates that driver management directly into its core.
Gotcha. So Playwright definitely seems to have an edge in terms of getting started quickly and easily. But how do they actually perform when it comes to real-world testing scenarios, those complex workflows that you often encounter in modern web applications?
Well, the article dives into the 2024 performance testing results, and that's where things get really interesting. They looked at both the speed of test execution and the resources each tool consumes. And what they found is that Playwright consistently demonstrates a performance advantage.
Okay, break it down for us. What kind of performance differences are we talking about?
So, for a basic task like loading a web page and doing a simple interaction, Playwright averaged about 290 milliseconds, whereas Selenium took 536 milliseconds. That's almost twice as fast for those fundamental checks.
Wow, that's a significant difference, especially if you're running tons of those basic tests.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to those more complex scenarios, the ones with lots of dynamic content loading and multiple user interactions, the gap narrows a bit, but Playwright still maintains its lead. In those tests, it averaged 1.2 seconds compared to Selenium's 2.1 seconds.
Still a noticeable improvement.
Yeah, and over time, those performance gains can really add up, especially when you're running full end-to-end test suites.
Makes sense. Now, what about resource utilization? Like, how much memory and processing power do they gobble up?
Well, according to the Rebrowser analysis, Playwright appears to be more resource efficient as well. At peak load, Playwright had a baseline memory footprint of around 250 megabytes, and then it added about 120 megabytes per browser instance it was controlling. Selenium had a higher baseline around 400 megabytes and consumed about 180 megabytes per instance.
So if you're running lots of parallel tests, that lower resource consumption with Playwright could translate to significant cost savings, especially in cloud-based testing environments.
Exactly. It can really impact your infrastructure costs.
Right, so Playwright's looking pretty good on the performance front. But let's dive into some of the more advanced features that modern web apps often require. What about things like network interception and modification?
Yeah, that's where Playwright really shines. It has these really powerful built-in APIs that let you intercept and manipulate network requests right within your test code.
That's super handy if you're trying to simulate things like slow internet connections or mock API responses to isolate parts of your app during testing.
Exactly. And the article even shows a code example where you're intercepting a request to an API and providing a custom JSON response. It's all very streamlined and elegant.
Whereas with Selenium, you typically need to set up a proxy server to do that kind of network manipulation, right?
Yeah, and that can get a bit complicated. Setting up, configuring, and managing a separate proxy server adds a whole layer of infrastructure and complexity that you might not want to deal with.
Okay, so another point for Playwright in terms of ease of use. What about parallel testing? That's essential for speeding up test execution, especially for large projects. How do they compare there?
Both frameworks support parallel execution, but they go about it in different ways. Playwright has built-in support for parallel testing. You configure it directly in its main configuration file, playwright.config.ts.
Okay, so right in that one file, you can say, hey, run my tests on Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit all at the same time using, say, 3 workers for each browser.
Exactly. It's all very integrated and straightforward. Selenium, though, usually relies on Selenium Grid for parallel testing.
Right, which involves setting up a hub and nodes, often using something like Docker.
Exactly. And while Docker can make that setup process easier, it's still an external infrastructure component that you need to manage separately.
So yet again, it seems like Playwright is aiming for that more integrated out-of-the-box approach.
It definitely is.
All right, let's switch gears now and talk about debugging. What happens when those tests inevitably fail?
Yeah, the dreaded debugging process.
What kind of support do Playwright and Selenium offer developers in that area?
Well, Playwright has some truly impressive built-in debugging tools that can be real lifesavers.
Tell me more.
The Trace Viewer is a standout feature. It captures a ton of information during your test runs, including automatic screenshots at every step, DOM snapshots, and even the specific lines of code that were executed.
So you can literally see the state of the app at each point in the test. That sounds incredibly helpful for pinpointing exactly where things went wrong.
It is. You can even save that whole trace as a zip file for later analysis.
Wow, so no more endless guessing games trying to figure out why a test failed.
In theory, yeah. Plus, there's the inspector tool, which is like a live DOM explorer you can use while your test is running. And for those of you just getting started with Playwright or who need to quickly generate basic test scripts, there's CodeGen. It can automatically create test code by recording your interactions in the browser.
So it's like having a little helper bot writing your initial tests for you.
Kinda, yeah.
That's cool. Now, how does Selenium handle debugging?
Selenium has the Selenium IDE, which is similar to Playwright's CodeGen. It's a record and playback tool for creating basic tests. But for more advanced debugging scenarios, you typically rely on the browser's built-in developer tools for remote debugging, and often integrate external logging and reporting frameworks to gather more information.
So it's more of a mix and match approach with Selenium, relying on a combination of built-in browser tools and external solutions.
Right, whereas Playwright aims for a more self-contained and unified debugging experience within its own ecosystem.
Gotcha. All right, so now that we've covered the core features and capabilities, let's shift our focus to best practices. What specific advice does the article offer for developers using either tool?
So for Playwright, the article really emphasizes taking advantage of its asynchronous nature, using async await for cleaner, more efficient test code. It also recommends following the page object model design pattern for organizing larger projects, using Playwright's built-in assertions for verifying expected outcomes, and utilizing fixtures for managing the setup and teardown of test environments.
That's all solid advice for UI automation in general, really, no matter what tool you're using.
Absolutely. Good practices are good practices.
Now, what about best practices for Selenium?
The guide stresses the importance of using explicit weights over implicit weights to avoid those frustrating, flaky tests. You know, the ones that pass sometimes and fail other times without any actual code changes.
Oh yeah, those are the worst.
Definitely. It also recommends using WebDriver Manager for handling those browser drivers, implementing robust error handling to catch potential issues, and creating reusable utility functions for commonly performed actions. It seems like the emphasis is on managing the potential complexities that can come with Selenium's architecture.
So Playwright's best practices are more about leveraging its modern features, whereas with Selenium, there's more of a focus on proactively addressing potential stability challenges that might arise.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Now, beyond the technical stuff, what's the overall buzz in the developer community? What are people saying about their real-world experiences with these tools?
Well, from what we're seeing online, Selenium is still the dominant player in the job market. That's not surprising considering its long history and how widely it's been adopted by companies over the years.
Yeah, lots of established businesses have invested heavily in Selenium-based automation, so it makes sense that it's still in high demand.
Right. But the article also highlights that Playwright is gaining traction incredibly fast, especially for new projects.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, developers who have made the switch from Selenium often say things like, I've never looked back. They talk about the dramatically reduced setup time and just a smoother overall experience, especially when they're working with modern web apps that rely on frameworks like React, Angular, or Vue.js.
That kind of enthusiastic feedback speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It really does. And it points to Playwright potentially becoming a major force in the future.
Now, are there any areas where opinions seem a bit more divided or where there's some healthy debate going on?
Yeah, the article mentions that there might be some resistance to change among some longtime Selenium users. Perhaps it's familiarity, existing investments in infrastructure, or maybe even a concern that a newer tool might not be as mature in the long run.
Those are all valid considerations, especially for large organizations.
Definitely. But proponents of Playwright argue that it addresses many of the pain points that Selenium users have been struggling with for years, and that it's well equipped to handle the demands of modern web development.
It's interesting to see how those perspectives are playing out in the community.
Yeah.
Now, for those who are just starting their journey into web automation, what's the general consensus on which tool might be easier to learn?
Well, Playwright seems to be gaining a lot of traction as a beginner-friendly option.
Makes sense, given its simpler setup and those integrated tools.
Exactly. Many instructors and online courses are now focusing on Playwright because of its more streamlined learning curve, clearer documentation, and that more cohesive overall ecosystem.
So it's a good entry point for newcomers.
It seems to be, yeah.
One final trend the article highlighted that I found really fascinating was the growing adoption of Playwright with Python.
Oh, right.
While Playwright's core is in the JavaScript world, Python users are increasingly finding that it offers many of the same benefits over Selenium when used with Python.
That's huge.
Yeah, it's not just limited to the JavaScript ecosystem anymore.
And especially for those data-focused tasks, it seems to be a winning combination.
So as we wrap this all up, it's clear that both Playwright and Selenium have their strengths.
Absolutely.
Playwright seems to excel for those new projects where rapid development, ease of use, and top-notch performance are paramount.
And Selenium's long history, extensive ecosystem, and that broad compatibility make it a really valuable choice for established applications, especially in those large enterprise environments.
The ultimate decision really hinges on your specific needs, your team's expertise, and any constraints you might be working with.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And to help you delve even deeper, the article provides links to the official documentation and GitHub repositories for both Playwright and Selenium.
Definitely check those out if you want to explore further.
So much great information available out there.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us today as we explored the world of Playwright and Selenium.
Absolutely. And as a final thought for everyone listening, with web technologies constantly evolving at such a rapid pace, what future challenges do you think automation tools will need to overcome? And how do you think Playwright and Selenium will adapt to meet those demands? It's something worth pondering as you think about your own automation strategies.
Lots to consider as we move forward in this ever-changing landscape.